Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Falling Walls Circle Table asking Science Communication in Crisis, Could We Do Better? These sessions are designed to give a spotlight to world-leading scientists, science strategists, and policymakers from academia, business, and politics to discuss how we can apply science, research, and innovation to get the world moving again. Now, here in the UK, where I am, we have just today started a new month of lockdown, so the thought of getting moving again does feel a bit more distant, but the promise from scientists all over the world in virology, in medicine, epidemiology, is that the response to COVID-19 will of course get better, culminating hopefully in more effective treatments and vaccines. It's become clear just how vital relevant science, good science communication and science journalism are this year. The problem is that we're not only fighting a virus, but we're also fighting misinformation, conspiracy theories, unscientific speculation. We're seeing tensions between scientists and politicians. So today we'll be discussing how we can do better as journalists and communicators and editors, what lessons we can learn, and how we might also apply these lessons to other threats that face humankind. And I'm honoured to be joined by a top-notch panel of speakers, each with very different perspectives on the problem. They are Melissa Fleming, United Nations Under-Secretary General for Global Communications and author of the book A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea. Laura Helmuth, Editor-in-Chief of Scientific American, previously at the Washington Post and National Geographic. Alan Rusbridger, Principal of Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, and former editor of The Guardian. Jan Zielonka, Professor of Politics and International Relations at the Universities of Venice and Oxford. Now, there will be time at the end for audience questions, so please submit them while we are speaking. You can submit them anytime you like in the chat function at the side of your screen. To start off, I just want to get each speaker to lay out for a few minutes their thoughts on what we've seen happening for the last year and give their personal perspectives on the question of this session, which is, again, is science communication in crisis? Could we do better? Now, I'll go in the same order that I've introduced everyone. So, Melissa, I'll start with you. As someone who's working on a global scale with the UN, how effective and coordinated do you think international communication, especially of the scientific facts, has been during this pandemic?
Thank you, Angela, and hello to everybody. You know, this is the first global pandemic that we've had in the social media age, and this is what has defined much of the problem that we're dealing with in communications. I think probably science communication and science journalism has been very good, very fine. It's what we're up against. What we're up against is what WHO coined early in the pandemic as an infodemic. And what is an infodemic? An infodemic is a mixture of good information with misinformation and disinformation. So what we have is an information environment that's polluted, basically. So how do we see that the clean air, the good science communication rises to the top? And that's very complex. And I think this is something that we just weren't ready for. We weren't ready for the discredited scientists, virologists, doctors who become social media stars by saying that the COVID-19 virus is a hoax, by, bit players peddling miracle cures that are actually resulting in people taking them and dying, by people denigrating mask wearing that has had a massive effect on public compliance with the guidelines that we know as you know, as science communicators, are the only way to manage through the COVID-19 crisis until we get a vaccine. So, it's a very complex and problematic space. And we're working, just to say, and maybe we can get into this a little bit later, there is a lot that we can do and that we are doing to try to ensure that, that the good quality science information bubbles to the top, and that the bad disinformation and misinformation is perhaps doesn't get we know that it travels faster than the virus, and often very faster than good information. So how do we put a stop to it? We're more media literacy, people really understanding that they need to check the source before they share, and also working with social media platforms, getting them to flag, getting them to to point out content that is bad, even to eliminate it, and then also to elevate the content that is going to help our public get through this terrible health crisis.
Wonderful, thank you. Coming to you, Laura, then, you're at the helm of one of the most influential popular publications in the world. How did you meet this infodemic challenge, and what do you think you could have done better?
Yeah, that's a good question. We met the challenge by first of all, increasing our own output, just publishing at all hours of the day, more stories, many more stories than we ever would have. And it was kind of all hands on deck. Everybody was covering the coronavirus, especially in March and April, even February. So we knew right away that misinformation and disinformation would be a challenge. And so we've had kind of these parallel streams of coverage, explaining what's the best science. We have a lot of stories that say in the headline, here's what we know so far. Here's what we do know and don't know about X part of the pandemic. So we've been trying to keep up with the science as it emerges, which is just happening so quickly. And then we have a stream of coverage that's, debunking bad information. And, that part is kind of maddening and exhausting, especially because in the United States, most of the bad information, or, most exposure to bad information that's going viral, that's getting a lot of attention, comes straight from the White House. So we've had to kind of use the science of misinformation to inform our own, most effective best practices for, debunking the conspiracy theories or conspiracy fantasies that are getting the most attention, and doing it in a way that replaces bad information with good information, and also kind of explains to people, well, here's where this myth comes from. Here's why people are believing it, but here's what's actually true. And then also, one of the big challenges, and I think something we'll have to keep working on, is that people often dismiss science or health reporting or science itself and say, well, it's constantly changing. 1 week coffee is good for you, 1 week coffee is bad for you. And so I think it's like one of our biggest challenges, and one thing we could be doing a lot better is being very transparent about how, why it is that the messages are changing, because they have, and how science works, and how it's not this doesn't mean it's a hoax or a conspiracy. This is actually updating our knowledge with better knowledge. And here's why we're changing our minds about things. So.
Wonderful, thanks so much. We'll come back to lots. That's so much to unpick. We'll come back to that when we debate later. Alan, then coming to you, there is a risk, of course, that newspaper coverage of the pandemic can be terrifying for readers, and I certainly know it was terrifying for me at the beginning of the pandemic. We were very, very scared. How do you feel newspapers have coped with the challenge of relaying the science, reliable facts around the health risks, but also keeping readers engaged and not scaring them?
Well, I think it's been a mixed story. To be fair to a lot of journalists, I think this probably was the first time in their lives when they realized that journalism could be about life and death, that if they were irresponsible in their journalism, people could die. And I think that has led to some good and well-crafted journalism, and people have relied on the best journalists. But it's also exposed some failings in journalism, and one of them is around business models and the necessity that some managers have felt in getting rid of specialists, so that the people who were science correspondents, science editors, who understood how science worked and the difficult business of communicating science uh, were often missing. They had gone, and the job fell to people who had no experience in communicating science. So that was one problem, and I think another problem is about metrics and newsroom metrics, and if they are geared to it could be audience, could be clickbaits, it could be eyeballs, it could be ideology. That's probably not going to lead to good journalism in a time when a lot of the issues really require slow, patient explanation and expertise. So I think it's mixed. There's a special place in hell, in my view, to the behaviour of Fox News early on, in which it slavishly followed the line of the president. And I think the people responsible should have a heavy responsibility. But it's also exposed the need for models of journalism which really built around public service. I'm thinking of public service broadcasters, which generally are trusted and which have resisted the temptation, which has regrettably become more pronounced during the pandemic, to fall back into ideological camps. So we've in the UK, we've seen a lot of very political arguments about the rights and wrongs of lockdowns, which have drifted away from science into ideology, and that, to my mind, is a dangerous trend.
Well, there's nothing a science journalist likes to hear better than an editor saying that we need more science journalists on newspapers, so thank you for that. Jan, then coming to you, as a professor of politics, looking at the way that science and politics have really collided this year, we're seeing scientists, on our TV screens standing next to prime ministers and presidents, giving their views on what they think should happen. How well has that relationship and the tension between science and politics been conveyed by journalists and communicators?
Well, I'm not sure which solution is better or worse, symbiosis of scientists with politicians, or a lack of communications between them and mutual accusations. Symbiosis could be very dangerous too. Let's not forget that many scientific advisors have vested interests, either political or economic. Many of them work with pharma, for instance, or health industry. Others are making semi-political careers. How many medical doctors became minister of health, for instance? Is it better or worse? If, for instance, if cardiologist has to run in pandemic like this, I'm not necessarily sure. There is mixed evidence of this. But what is the most important here is trust, because these pandemics and particular policies to combat the virus, they affect people in a very uneven way, and they affect them not only in the domain of health, but also in economic domain. Private lives have been shattered. People lost jobs. Governments are doing things we couldn't imagine before. There was enormous intervention in public and individual life caused by these pandemics. And there is science and science. Economics professors will tell you probably different things than medical doctor. And also, the medics also work on the patchy evidence sometimes, and it makes a difference whether you come from the field of public health, for instance, or you work as a virologist. So I have to say there was a lot of natural confusion in all these flows of information. I wouldn't necessarily assume that those who live on generating fake news were getting upper hands. But there is no one truth here, not the best policy to deal with these pandemics, because there are a lot of unexpected side effects, and those effects are always affecting people in an uneven way. So you need to have some kind of compromise, social contract, at a time when 50% of electorate doesn't trust the government, and it doesn't really depend who is in power. We are living in a very complex time.
Well, there's lots to go through then from what all four of you have just said, but I just want to start with the issue of presenting the science as we feel that we know it at the time, because one of the big challenges of this year has obviously been that, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, we had very little scientific information or data, and yet the public were hungry for it. They needed it in order to feel that they could know what they needed to do and how to manage their lives. Laura, then, just coming to you, how can science journalists and editors like you manage that desire that people have, that hunger that people have for health information, for scientific information, with the fact that it just doesn't exist?
Yeah, that's been a huge challenge. And I think, the first thing we can do is say what we do and don't know, and say, here are the gaps, here how they're working to fill the gaps. Here's what here's where we stand in the process, and also set realistic expectations. I think looking back at the early stages of the pandemic, for a while it seemed like, oh, well, I'll just stay home for a couple of weeks and it'll be fine. And I think, we didn't kind of challenge some of our expectations of normalcy at the very beginning. And I think, another thing we didn't do well at the very beginning was look, at least for the US and probably for other Western reporters, we didn't look enough to Asia. If we had normalized wearing masks early on, I think that would have made a big difference. But instead, we kind of got tangled up into questions of, which masks, stop which aerosols and things like that. And I think that, sometimes, one of the dangers of being a specialist science writer is you can go down rabbit holes and want to know absolutely everything before you say what's good enough, what we have enough evidence for. So I think we're getting better at that, but that's probably a balance that has been shifting throughout the pandemic.
Melissa, coming to you then on this mask question, because you also brought it up earlier. In the early parts of this year, I remember that people were very confused about whether they should be wearing masks or not, and some of the advice coming from the WHO was don't wear one, and then it kind of counteracted this instinct that many people had that they did want to wear one, but then they were being told no, we shouldn't. And then later that changed, obviously, as we had more information about how the virus is spread, that they should wear it. What do you think that kind of confusion did to kind of public trust in what was going on and what scientists were telling them?
Unfortunately, a lot of damage, because that was, coupled with kind of irresponsible leadership and advice. I mean, and twisting of perhaps that guidance that was presented as, as we stand now in the backdrop of also shortages and, with the knowledge that we have today. I think, as Laura said, this is the challenge of communicating science, because science is changing, particularly when you're dealing with a novel virus that we know very little about at the outset. So I think what's really important is the communication of science, but communication of the process of getting to the guidance that is derived from the science as well. So, why did it change, and why are we now advising? And that has to be extremely clear. The problem, I think, a number of you also said this, was that, if we had a combination, and where we did have a combination of responsible leaders who were trusting the science, and their public health institutions were being supported by leadership, the kind of pseudoscience, lack of trust, public trust, fertile ground for misinformation was much less than in the places where we had both kind of irresponsible leadership or shifting kind of leadership guidance and misinformation. We had misinformation everywhere. And we had, at the beginning, really misinformation that was traveling faster than the virus. I think that what we're trying to do at the UN, WHO, the UN, the team that I lead, is what I think Laura also said, what science journalists are trying to do. We're trying to make sure that good information, science-based information, prevails. And just leaving you with one of the problems, it's not just that we don't communicate or very well shifting guidance as the science shifts, but also very often the communications that comes out from public institutions, from the UN, from, it's like a PDF that has 235 pages. And then you have like the pandemic video that is a slickly produced, for the masses, playing on everybody's, instinctual fears, kind of competition that goes viral and has millions of views on social media. We need to study that. Why did that go viral? And can we, of course, we don't speak in black and white terms as responsible science communicators, but we are endeavoring now to create the kind of content that also travels well on social media, and recruit people to help us share it in the groups, and so that it's also popular in the algorithms. So that's another subject too, but I just wanted to raise that.
Jan, coming to you then, do you think it was a failure of leadership? Do you agree that it was poor politics that meant that there was so much confusion, for example, over mask wearing?
It's very difficult to escape from politics. Of course, if you ask me, do you trust President Trump or Dr. Fauci? I would rather prefer that Dr. Fauci makes decisions. But at the end of the day, it is President Trump who was elected and who can be taken to responsibility for what he does, and hopefully he will be held to responsibility very soon. But at the end of the day, scientists can advise politicians, but politicians have to balance various scientific evidence. Scientific evidence, not just from the field of medicine, but from many other different fields, primarily economics. Of course, those fields are very well connected, but when they take those decisions, so you can say in the long run, if you ignore scientific medical evidence, economy will also suffer. But the problem is that politicians make those decisions not just on the basis of scientific evidence, which is, as I said, patchy and sometimes conflicting, but also under pressure of various interest groups, either political or economic. And they all have their ideology, so to speak, the definition of normality, what is good for the people. And it's very difficult for them to make those calls sometimes. I not always assume that they have bad intentions, but I see that their decisions affect individuals in different ways, and you cannot have effective policy unless, during this pandemic in particular, unless people cooperate. Because you can run by decree, but if people ignore those things, because you have to, for instance, make sure that they follow instructions at their own private houses. How you are going to control this? Even the Stasi system wouldn't be, in the German Democratic Republic wouldn't be able to control those behaviors. So the issue of trust is here fundamental. And of course, the media play the role to explain people, to communicate what is, and to basically separate fake news from scientific evidence. But the problem with the media is today that not only politics is partisan, media are also partisan, I'm afraid. I have my favorite media, but I cannot really say that they are fully objectives. I'm not going to give here an example, but it's not only, as Alan said, that the Fox News is partisan. They are maybe more partisan than CNN, but you know what I mean. And we are living in the situations and have to make decisions as individuals which affect us in an enormous way.
Alan, how would you respond to that then?
Well, I completely agree that in the end, this issue of trust is the most important thing, because, as Jan said, you can't make decisions in something like this without a degree of consensus, and degree of that consensus has to be based on, I think, both trust and evidence. And by the way, I think COVID is a dress rehearsal for climate change on this. The lessons we're learning now are going to be really important in terms of climate change, because the decisions that politicians are going to be making about climate change will be impossible if you've got a reading and viewing public who either haven't been prepared for the truth or have been actively steered away from the truth. I mean, it's just going to make the management of climate change impossible.
But in that sense, I mean, just picking up on that, I mean, we have had quite a number of decades now of people trying to explain climate change to us, the need to act. Were the failures there then also the same failures that we saw this year?
So some of them, yeah. I mean, the ideological split that I was talking about, that Jan was talking about, this partisanship in which you feel, certainly the British media, the coverage of the lockdown, this sort of move towards herd immunity as a theory, even if it doesn't work in practice. These are ideological divides, in the same way that you get newspapers that have just decided they're against climate change, and they'll either ignore it or they'll rubbish it. So you get into this question of evidence, and I think it may be dawning on journalists that societies can't work without evidence. Unless you have agreed evidence, then nothing works. And so I think journalists have got to be more upfront. They can probably learn a bit from scientists in this respect about presenting their evidence rather than simply saying, trust me, I'm a journalist.
Well, there's also this question of trust me, I'm a scientist, isn't there? Because, I mean, as you just said, there are different theories out there, and they don't come just from politicians or from ideologues, they also come from scientists themselves. Laura, then, you know, it is possible for politicians to cherry pick the scientists they want in order to fit the ideology that they have or the policy that they want to carry through. How do you, I mean, as communicators and journalists, how do we manage that? How do we then bring balance to a debate in which even some scientists disagree?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that really is a journalist's responsibility to, not just seek out expertise, but seek out the proper experts. We had kind of a crisis, especially early in the pandemic, of who are credentialed in one field, who became sort of armchair epidemiologists and were doing their own back of the envelope modeling, making all kinds of unwarranted assumptions that that the pandemic was either going to be much better than we thought or much worse than we thought. And these things tend to do well on social media. So it was very important for journalists to evaluate those claims very skeptically and not just be wowed because somebody's got a PhD in statistics. So that's been a challenge. And, and I think one thing that science journalists learned maybe a little bit belatedly, and political journalists should learn from science journalists, is the danger of both sidesing something. So with climate science, it's been at least a decade since responsible science journalists have included a science skeptic or science denier in routine coverage, just like we wouldn't include a creationist or an anti-vaccine activist or something. So I think, that's something that I hope political journalists have been learning, especially in the U.S. in the past 4 years, that if it's more important to say what's true and right and why we think it's true, rather than say, oh, here's two sides of an issue, choose for yourself.
The problem is that, one of the phrases we kept hearing this year was follow the science, we're following the science. But if the science isn't very clear, then what does that really mean? Melissa?
I think particularly, I think both of those issues are really important. And for the UN, these are the most, salient issues for us in terms of our advocacy. We're making a renewed push because right now on climate action, because we believe there's appetite, actually. Our slogan is recover better and recover greener. And use your stimulus packages in the right way, and we've seen a number of countries actually kind of listening to their populations who are saying we need some hope, and announcing going net zero by 2050 and stopping plans for new coal plants, et cetera. So there is some momentum, and yeah, these are the two crises, but they're crises based on science. I think for us as a communicator for the UN, where on climate change, a lot of the science actually originates. We're the authors of many of the reports. We have to get better at communicating them ourselves. We are in ourselves a communications outfit. We employ journalists and we communicate to huge, sectors of the public. We have millions of followers on our social media channels. People come to our platforms for reliable and trusted information. And it's our challenge to make that information accessible. Also, via journalists, how we deliver this information to science journalists and other journalists so that they can use it and communicate to their publics. But we have a responsibility ourselves to communicate our findings, but communicate it in a way that is accessible to all kinds of members of the public. But I think, just leaving you with one last thought, I mean, I was struck by what Laura said, that once there is consensus on the science, don't present the other side. We have the consensus, and we certainly believe in the consensus on the science. And we work for a cause, and so we don't want to just leave people with just informing them. We want to find ways to use communications to get people to really care and to understand why they should care, and then to give people something to do. So that's kind of the formula that we use, so that we can, whether it's governments in a big way or individuals through small actions, this is the way that we're shifting our communication so that we're not just informing, but we're also creating kind of empathy and action.
Alan, do you feel that perhaps coverage of the pandemic has been too dominated by political journalists? And I'm thinking here particularly of here in the UK, at the press briefings that the government has held, almost all the questions have been asked by political journalists. I don't think I've seen very many, if any, science journalists asking the Prime Minister questions or his scientific advisors. And I wonder if things get left out that way.
I think that's a very important point. I think my old colleague, Emily Wilson, who's a New Scientist, was very excited because one of her journalists did actually get to ask a question at one of the press conferences. But I think if in this world in which sometimes when it suits them, you get the sense that politicians are hiding behind the scientists, it's very important to be able to have scientifically literate journalists there who can ask sensible, probing questions, so that you haven't just got political journalists who don't know much about, why should they, who can't really test the science or know what questions to ask.
So do you think that politicians have hidden behind the scientists here?
I think they have when it's suited them. I mean, just most recently, it was very striking when Johnson had changed his mind again and decided that we were all going to have to go into lockdown again. He more or less said nothing. He just pushed Valence and Whitty out and said, "Go on, show them your graphs." And we had 20 minutes of PowerPoint before Johnson came out and said, "Well, there, what am I supposed to do?" But 2 weeks earlier, Sage had been telling him that this is exactly what he had to do, and at that point the scientists were nowhere to be seen because it didn't suit Johnson at that point to foreground the science.
Well, the other phenomenon that we've seen coming to you, Jan, is politicians, as well as sometimes hiding behind scientists, is turning on scientists if they don't say what they want them to say, which we've certainly seen in the US, for example, in the treatment of Anthony Fauci. What kind of damage does that do to democracy, to trust in science, and also in turn to trust in politicians?
Oh, this is of course terrible if there is scientific evidence just to ignore it, and the case you mentioned is so obvious that we don't need to discuss, and we can only condemn it. But I don't think it makes much sense in this particular setting. But but we have to understand that scientists don't tell us many things which are crucial here. The politicians, of course, will always try to use science when it suits them and silence scientists if it doesn't suit their argument. But at the end of the day, science doesn't, but in this case, medical science doesn't tell you whether poor or rich should shoulder the costs of the pandemic in the first place, or doesn't tell you whether older or younger generation should take the heat of the regulations to combat the COVID. These are questions scientists cannot answer. And then there are, of course, moral questions. Scientists can tell you that the spread of COVID is most dangerous in care homes for elderly people. But does it mean that you can cut them off from anybody because this is contagious? That you cannot allow family to visit them even if they are dying? These are terrible moral dilemmas which scientists, in particular statisticians, cannot help us to address.
But then, do you think the problem is partly the siloing of different disciplines? That scientists are in one corner, policymakers are in another corner, and we don't have enough people who are able to navigate the ethical, the political, the scientific, the economic questions all at once, that everybody's off doing their own jobs and not really coordinating. Jan?
Well, but it's easy to say. Science is complicated today, and you can be it's better than you see the forest rather than the tree, but you also need specialists who understand the tree and not just see the forest. So, and universities are in a way enterprises as all other enterprises where people compete for positions, income, and power. And in a way, it wouldn't be a good idea to just administrate heavy-handedly everything among scientists and make them, work together to produce the correct outcomes. It would be just absurd. We would kill all intellectual curiosities, and it simply doesn't work. Look, of course, here again, how governments can tell to scientists, yes, you should do interdisciplinary research because otherwise, you do not understand each other. But each time somebody submits an article or a book which is interdisciplinary, specialists who are gatekeepers of the discipline will tell you, no, you cannot mix politics with history or sociology with politics. This is the world we are living in, and we have to accept it as it is. And not overdo it by administrative engineering. I just don't believe in that. At the same time, it is not like this that anything goes and everything you read on the social media is necessarily correct and true. No.
Well, I mean, on this issue of mixing science and politics, I think, certainly in my experience, scientists, or at least most scientists, are very reluctant to get involved in politics. Indeed, many of them see themselves as above politics. They work completely separate from it. Laura, remarkably this year, the Scientific American, your publication, has decided to take a stance on the American election. Can you explain to me why you did that? And also the stance that you've taken, in case people don't already know.
We are all in for Joe Biden. For the first time in Scientific American's 175-year history, we endorsed a politician for a U.S. presidential candidate, and we did it strictly based on science, health, and environment concerns. There are a lot of reasons to vote for Biden over Trump, but if you just look at climate, at how his policies have interfered with international collaboration among scientists, especially the pandemic response has just been, not just ignorant, but kind of sociopathic. Like the lack of empathy, the lack of understanding, the rejection of evidence, and then casting doubt on the on experts themselves, on the journalists who are trying to tell the story. So it's not just sharing misinformation, but like actively interfering with the sharing of good information. So for all these reasons, we endorsed Biden. And what was interesting then. The journal Nature, the New England Journal of Medicine, and then a lot of other science organizations. Some are prevented from making an explicit endorsement because of their tax-exempt status or their non-governmental organization status. So that was, but I think every science organization in the U.S. that could kind of got us, made it very clear that just based on the interest of having good science, having evidence-based policy, that another 4 years of Trump would be catastrophic.
And how has that gone down with your readers and also with scientists?
We were nervous. We were a little bit afraid that we'd get a lot of cancellations and a lot of hate from people who say, oh, you're politicizing science, to which we would say, no, actually, Trump politicized science. We're just responding to that. And big science. But we ended up getting a really, really good response. And a lot of, we did lose a few subscriptions, but a lot of people subscribed. We got a lot of, I think our most common response was just thank you. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for saying it clearly and for showing that science isn't an apolitical issue, or at least not this year. So it worked out pretty well. We're glad we did it. I don't know how many votes we swayed, but it looks like this election is going to hang by 3 or 4 votes. So if we did anything, we're happy about that.
Alan, coming to you then, newspapers quite routinely and some broadcasters quite routinely take positions when it comes to elections. How do you feel about seeing science journalists and science publications taking those kind of stands?
Well, I think that's, I didn't know that about Scientific American, and I think it's completely inspiring to hear it for the reasons that Laura says. I think it's so clear cut on the science that I think it's a brave and right thing to do. And I offer wholehearted congratulations. I might even take out a subscription myself.
There you go. You've gained a subscriber. All right, it's worked out. Melissa, coming to you. I mean, a lot of people like to see science as neutral, as objective, as not having anything to do with politics. Then, is this a year that changed?
Yeah, I think I think science was politicized, and I think what we need to do is get it back. And obviously, I think Laura just said that they, took a political decision with the endorsement, but in a way, that's bringing. The purpose of that is to depoliticize science, or to separate it from the politics in the longer run, and that science should inform politics. And science certainly informs the United Nations and the Secretary General and how he and we act, and the policies that we propose and the advocacy that we undertake vis-a-vis member states. So yes, I think what we need now is to depoliticize science, but to popularize the science. And I do think I don't know if we can all believe opinion polls now, because they were slightly discredited with the U.S. election. But according to opinion polls, actually scientists did gain in credibility in this crazy period. So we have actually an initiative, and we haven't yet touched on the vaccine and the issue of vaccine hesitancy. I think there was some mention of anti-vaxxers and not giving them the space. The problem is they have actually become quite a force in the space of trying to drive, drive some fear in people of the coming COVID-19 vaccine. And we're working very hard to kind of pre-bunk that and to remind people of the value in history of vaccination, and also that of the process. So we're actually trying to humanize the vaccine by elevating the scientists who are working in labs all over the world and giving them the kind of communication tools via social media channels and media coverage, so that they can become the public's guides into the science of the process of working on a COVID-19 vaccine. So I think what we're trying to do is just make science more accessible, and to be very cognizant of the platforms that people use to get their information, and how we need to package science so that people can find it even more attractive and understandable and interesting.
I wish we had more time to talk about misinformation and disinformation, but we've got so many comments and questions in the chat, so I'm going to go to them now, if that's okay. First question here is, how can science compete with state and non-state actors who have the money to manipulate information systems, including tech giants like Facebook and Twitter, and use them to promote misinformation and disinformation? In fact, this is asking the question that I would have asked. This will become critical when a vaccine is produced. Do we need to get organized now as a science community? And I would add to that question, a lot of the ways, much of the ways in which many of us get our news now is not through mainstream media outlets, but through social media, mediated by our friends or family, and often within these filter bubbles. How do science communicators deal with that? How do journalists deal with that? Alan, can I come to you with that?
Well, I think Melissa touched on it earlier when she talked about her own responsibility for communicating science. And, the truth of living in 2020 is that everybody is a communicator. Everyone is a media company. Everyone has their own website. Everyone has their own social media feed. And it seems to me that that's the way to go. Don't wait to be mediated. Get as good as you can and as trusted as you can in communicating science, because you might be able to do it better than a lot of the old business models, which have got rid of the specialists in the way that I talked about to begin with. I mean, I'm very struck in some of the techniques of trust that I see by the best people on social media. Okay, we could spend the evening talking about the misinformation and disinformation, but the best people, whether they be scientists or lawyers or doctors, they, as I said earlier, they don't approach the problem of communication by saying, "Trust me, I'm a journalist." They assume that you might not want to trust them, so they say, "Here's my evidence, here's my screenshot, here's my link, and by the way, please come in and argue with me. If I get something wrong, I'll correct it immediately." So these seem to me 21st techniques of trust that you see really well displayed by the best people on social media. And I think people are now learning that they don't have to wait to be mediated. They can get out there and do it themselves.
Jan, what are your thoughts on that question?
The internet revolutionized our communications in a very short period of time. We shouldn't forget that the internet has 3 decades only and is in the common use even in a shorter period. But and it changed democracy beyond recognitions. It also changed the media beyond recognitions. Alan can tell you how newspapers today are struggling because of the internet. But this is nothing new. When the printed press was invented, it revolutionized politics and democracy too. It's enough to look at the printed press during revolution in France. It was just like a social equivalent of social media. It was very passionate, very polarized, very bold language, a lot of caricatures and visions has already played the role. Then when radio and television came, democracy had to adjust again. And a lot of people thought, well, with television, you get video politics. Famous Italian professor from Columbia University wrote a book about video politics and how this basically kills democracy. We have to adjust to different modes of communication each time when technology brings something new on our table.
And so how do you think we should be adjusting to this? I mean, what should we be doing? Because at the moment it feels like it's taking us very much off guard.
Yes, it's taking us off guard, but not here. It's not only again a technology which is driving the whole change. There is also business and model and a lot of money involved with new technologies. And here the mega tech companies have a virtual monopoly in doing what they wish. And there is no public authority to bring those transnational corporations to to order, and that is the problem that we have now those technologies and communications which is totally transnational, and the only public authority we have of any meaning is a nation state which is unable to cope with those transnational flows of communication and money and technology.
So do we need
And
regulation here? Do we need some kind of internet regulation that we don't have?
No, public authority is not just about regulation, because the regulations, if it doesn't have legitimacy, is being ignored. We have to somehow build a sort of democracy and governance on the level where those transactions and communications take place, and it is not so easy, because to move from nation states to the global level is we have seen in the United Nations. The United Nations is totally controlled by member states, and Melissa can do very little. Particularly the most powerful member states don't give her resources and powers to do something. And today we see the opposite. They take away money and powers from organizations like World Health Organizations and the United Nations itself. I understand that Secretary General is trying to find money from other sources than states. But when he goes to private business, then of course he is running the problem of conflicts of interest and corporate pressure and so on. But how else
I feel
he
like we're
can
getting
do
off topic now.
what people expect from him?
Well, we've only got 10 minutes left, and I want to get some more questions. And I think this is a good one for Laura and Melissa. The questioner asks, Galileo is quoted saying, "You cannot teach a man anything. You can only help him find it within himself." I believe part of the issue is we need to move along the scale from information dissemination to dialogue and engagement to allow people to develop the skills to identify fact from fake. So this is really a question about critical thinking. Do the panel have a view on how science communication and public engagement can work together to reach an outcome that includes self-realization and public ownership of facts? Can I come to you first, Laura, because I think this is really about equipping people with the tools they need to interpret scientific information even when it is contradictory.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so important. And I think we're finally getting away from what's called the deficit model of science communication, which is the idea that if people only knew what we know, they would see things our way. But it's really hard to pedantically tell people what they need to know about science. And some of the projects that work are the community science projects. There's the co-creation of knowledge, or some of the words that people use to describe how scientists working with people who aren't scientists but have questions that can be solved by science, how they can be learn from each other, be much more productive than just a kind of a top-down, science-down type of communication. So it's really important. I think this is something that science communicators are just now kind of appreciating the importance of and trying to do better at. But one thing, kind of getting related to the previous question too, I think social media has really democratized this, and it's a great way to ask questions, to share ideas, to amplify important messages and debunk bad messages, and really anybody can do it. And so I think we're seeing kind of an increased capacity for science communication among all kinds of people, partly thanks to social media.
Melissa, then coming to you, it does feel sometimes that as though government websites, UN website, WHO, are kind of handing down information from above without really giving us the opportunity to interact with that and understand it. Do you think that's an issue?
It is, and I think that's one of the problems that we saw early on, that this is really a communications crisis where other actors were getting the upper hand because they knew better how to use social media to package information, to make it more engaging, to play on people's emotions and their fears. So we've really tried to change that. Of course, we're going to have the website that is can all things for all people, where you can find the heavy reports. But we're spending a lot of energy investment, people power in taking that content and producing in ways that, again, is also not top down. On social media, the only way to be successful if you are engaging. That means that people aren't just consuming the content; they're actually engaging with it. This is one of the dangers of social media too, on the misinformation side. So we've also we have a campaign out there called Pause, based on behavioral science that tells us that, if we do take some bit of time, even if it's just 30 seconds, to look into what is that information that we're seeing in our feed, what is the source, and what is the date, what is that photograph, and take a little break before we impulsively share it, which is what a lot of people are doing and which is one of the sources of our problem. Then you can also learn to engage with that information better and to identify the good science over the bad. So we are spending a lot more time on this kind of engagement and involvement of our communities rather than just broadcasting and dictating to them.
Alan, I just want to come to you here. What are mainstream media news organizations and editors doing now to deal with the circumstances that we find ourselves in which there is this ecosystem in which you can get your news. You can get your news from the Guardian if you want, but you can quite easily also get it from social media, from your next door neighbor sharing a graph or or a piece of scientific information, and it feels just as visible and just as in your face as a newspaper that is on a newsstand. I mean, how do you create trust in information authority in a system like that?
Well, I agree with everything that Melissa just said about communication in the 21st century. It is not just two-way, but multi-way. I mean, we lived for 300 years. Jan was referencing Gutenberg, and that heralded a time when anybody who owned a printing press or a broadcasting studio had a virtual monopoly on the messaging, and we grew used to information flowing in a vertical way from top to bottom. And now this has been replaced in the space of 20 years by 4 billion people talking to each other horizontally. You can't ignore that. You can't pretend it hasn't happened. And I think the best media that I know are treating this in a way in which they're very responsive to what's going on out there. I mean, 15 years ago, there was this phrase that was coined, my readers know more than I do. And if you can harness that knowledge and behave in an open, responsive way, show your evidence, correct things when you get them wrong, be prepared to get the readers on your side, almost co-creating the content. I think that's the way that successful media will go.
Laura, I just want to come to you here because I know from personal experience how difficult it is to communicate nuanced, complex ideas on social media. These are not platforms designed for scientific engagement, I don't think sometimes, just because science is more complex than that. It's not it's not about headlines, it's not about, brief top lines. How are you as an editor dealing with communicating science in that way?
Yeah, it is a challenge. And the most important words in any story right now are the headline words, which can be, 3 to 10 words. And that's what you've got to tell your story. It's some more characters on Twitter or Facebook. And so we're really putting a lot of effort into making the headlines clear and accurate and engaging and sort of welcoming for people to come in and learn more. But that's, and that's the vast amount of interaction people have with any information is only what they see scrolling through their feeds. So, responsible headlines are crucial, and some publications do better than others. Some make mistakes a lot and then get a lot of grief on social media about it. And the good ones, do better next time.
I will very quickly, we've literally only got like 1 or 2 minutes left, but I'll very quickly go to one more question. It is, how could we speed up more integrated advice to politicians and the public from different disciplines, well beyond virology and public health, such as social psychology, economics, etc., to ensure better strategies to deal with a pandemic? And Jan, I'll come to you very quickly here then, because you are not a scientist, you work in politics. I mean, how do we combine disciplines in this way?
Look, let me start with the Galileo, which you mentioned before, because I happen to speak to you now from the countryside just outside Florence, where Galileo is buried. And the story of Galileo tells you that the communication between science and those in power is not always easy. He was tried and persecuted for his views. He was the subject of inquisition. And you know, we shouldn't forget this, that speaking the scientific truth is not always what those in power want to hear. And unfortunately, things are not very different today. Of course, maybe there is no inquisition like in medieval times, but very often scientists who tell uncomfortable truths to those who are in power are either silenced or just deposed of various institutions they run. This is, I'm afraid, still with us. So the most important thing is that we are honest with each other, able to communicate, and are transparent with what we do.
Well, on that quite on that quite depressing note, I think, sadly, although this has been a wonderful debate, I think we have to wrap up there because we have hit our time limit. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. I could really have just asked you questions all day, and there were many more questions in the chat, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. But thank you to the audience also for joining us. The next Falling Walls Circle Table is tomorrow at 12 p.m. CET, titled Foresight: How to Avoid Another 2020. There are highlights at noon GMT or 1 p.m. Berlin time, presented by Falling Walls and Berlin Science Week on the website, and details of all these events are available, of course, on www.falling-walls.com. But for now, thank you so much to everyone for listening, and thank you again to our wonderful panel of speakers.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.